I remember I was in Lebanon, and I was in South Lebanon, which at the time was controlled by the Israelis, and the Israelis had bombed just over the border at a refugee camp. They were trying to get a guy who was with the Black September movement. Now, by this point, the Black September movement, which is a Palestinian movement, was pretty well past its sell-by date, but they wanted to get this guy named Munir Makta, and they had bombed his house. And so he was off somewhere else in this refugee camp, and we went to find him. And we found where we thought he was, and it was a house which was a couple of stories high and very narrow. And I knocked on the door with the translator, and the translator says, and of course we've got a camera, we'd like to speak to Munir Makta. And this guy looks at us, and he looks at me, and I'm wearing jeans and a button-up shirt. And he looks at me, and he says to the translator, "Tell her to do up her shirt." And I had a few buttons, so I do up the shirt. He looks at me again, and he says, "Tell her to do up the top button." I do up the top button. He says, "Okay, you can come in. I'm Munir Makta." So we go in, and we go all the way to the top floor of this house to do an interview. And he's got guys with AK-47s around him, and he's got shell casings lined up, from 50-millimeter bullets sort of lined up on a shelf. I don't know why. And we do the interview. And when I finished the interview, this guy is still being looked for by the Israelis, and Lebanese radio is actually saying, "Do not hang out in this camp, do not hang out near these people because they are targets." So I get up and I go, "Thank you, I want to leave." And he says, "Now we have tea." So I had to sit down and have tea with him. And I was very afraid of both him and of being where I was. But something about the tea. I was in Moscow a couple of years ago for The Current, and we wanted to interview a man named Andrei Lukovoy. Now, Lukovoy is a member of the Russian Duma. He's a politician. But you may know that name. He was in the news because he's the guy they think spiked the tea of the former KGB agent. Do you remember that story in Britain? The guy was in a London hotel, and he met some people for tea, and they had put polonium, radioactive chemical, in his tea, and he died. And he died a very slow and agonizing death. And it is widely believed, that man's name was Alexander Litvinenko, former KGB spy. It's widely believed that Andrei Lukovoy was the guy who did that and facilitated that. So we're going to Moscow, and we want to do an interview with Mr. Lukovoy, and we get an interview. So we're going into the Duma that day with the translator and my producer, and I say to her, "Okay, no matter what, if he gives us tea, we don't drink it." So we're sitting there, and we do the interview, and, I don't know what we thought. Did we think he was going to say, "Oh, yeah, I put it in the tea. Yes, I'm guilty." The fact is, he was in Moscow, and he was untouchable. The British wanted him, of course, and Interpol wanted him. So I'm going to drink the water, and it's sealed, so there's nothing in it. We do the interview, and as we go to leave, and he doesn't offer us tea, he says, "Are you in Moscow for a while? My daughter has a cafe. You should go to the cafe." And he gives us the address. So we think, okay, let's go to the cafe. So we walk up and down in front of the cafe because we're afraid to go in. We don't know what to expect. And we go into the cafe, and it's very shishi. It's like post-communist Russian moneyed cafe. And we sit down, and we think, okay, we'll order some tea, and we're rolling our computer, well, it is computerized, but our tape recorder, so we can get some sound of this, and we can play with it on the radio in a few days when we go to air with this. And we look at this, and we go to order, and we just can't. We are so afraid that he's actually got somebody following us, and he's as if he would poison us with tea, that we just flee the cafe. But the story of Andrei Lukovoy isn't the story of Andrei Lukovoy at all. It's the story of Vladimir Putin. And it's about the power of Vladimir Putin because, of course, he was the guy who it's believed, wanted Litvinenko dead because Litvinenko started telling his secrets, the secrets of Russia. And so it's just about how one person wields power and how the story unfolds. And, it's easy to ask questions sometimes, and sometimes it's very difficult to ask questions, but it's my job. And I don't always get an answer that matters, and sometimes people get very angry with me, but I keep on asking because I'm trying to understand what's going on, and I'm trying to connect the dots so much of what goes on in our world now is connected to something else that's happening in the world. And it's my job to do that, whether it's connecting an event to a wider political agenda or connecting an economic issue here to an economic issue over there, and trying to understand how a decision maybe by a CEO or a politician or some kind of person of influence can affect how we live our lives. Because make no mistake, the decisions made by other people absolutely affect how we live our lives.